Well, good morning, everyone. It's been a little difficult to concentrate on things in the last little while. That's a few hours, that is. Everything that you're talking about, and we're certainly talking about a lot of prophetic things in this talk, I just had to turn it off. So I'm not informed as to what happened overnight because that's the only way I can focus on what I'm doing here. It's certainly very enlivening to see what's going on, and as usual, some of the things that happen are very unexpected. But anyway, what we're wanting to do in our study here on Isaiah is very precise in one area. We don't want to talk about Isaiah generally. We want to talk about the Isaiah scroll. And that relates to the fact of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found. And Israel did highlight this scroll. They highlighted it as the sort of the number one scroll for all the scrolls that they found. And they have found bits and pieces of every book of the Bible. But the Isaiah scroll was found intact. And that was probably one of the major differences between it and other scrolls. They found every chapter. It was sort of, to my mind, a bit of an end of a controversy that scholars have been debating for a long time as to whether there were two Isaiahs, and that somehow rather what we have is a compilation of two different people that were writing under the name Isaiah. But the book was found intact. There was no such division, it would seem, made at the time of the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, because that book actually predated his ministry. So we want to look at just what is going on with the way the scrolls are being introduced to the world. Well, they took a long time for anything much to be said about them. Well, people examined them and went over them. But some of the things that I found were written by the person who was in charge at the time. We'll quote his name and you'll have a chance to look at what he had to say. But altogether, in my mind, they missed a golden opportunity to tell the world what God had revealed to the prophet Isaiah. And what they wanted to make out of it all was the fact that these books had survived all that time. Wasn't it wonderful? How did they do it? Who were the people that hid them? What was society like at that time? Why did they hide them there? All these other questions. But they did not talk about the God of Israel. So what we are doing in these classes is, I wanted to talk last week about the excitement of finding them, and then the disappointment generally about the way that they were then talked about and introduced to those who were wondering what was in the scroll. This morning we want to concentrate on the work of Yahweh and Isaiah working together, God with his prophet, and the credentials that they had and that they showed in the prophecy of Isaiah itself. That's what I think is part of what was missed. I want to talk next week about the blindness of Israel. Might have a few extra comments as we digest things from what's happened and what is still happening. We wanted to talk about the confusing nature of Christendom, how they looked at the scrolls and what did Christendom make of them, and how did it influence their view of Israel and of the book of Isaiah from time past. We wanted to look at the secular society and how they missed it. And what I mean by that is how United Nations, for instance, or all the nations of the world, how they looked at that and what they made of it. And then finally, just to wrap it up, on how Yahweh will be vindicated. And vindicated just means shown to be right in what he has done in light of all the things that we're talking about. Now, I've thought it important to try to give you a little more of what I really mean by this. And I was sitting in here, as all of you probably were as well, listening to Brother Rod speak last Sunday. And he used this verse, but he used it to speak of the end of verse 17 about the compassion of God. And while he was reading through it, I thought, well, that's exactly the point I've been trying to make in the beginning of the verse in these classes. The fact was that Nehemiah said of the people, of his people of Israel, they refused to obey. They were not mindful of your wonders that you did among them. Now, that's the problem. People can recognize a wonder like crossing through the Red Sea and celebrating it on the other side, and a week later, it's not impacting them hardly at all. Now, that's part of human nature. We all share that. That's a problem we have to face. And we really can't contain ourselves in keeping the excitement in our minds about events. Probably a good idea that we can't. In one sense, it would just wear us out because it's high stress. But on the other hand, to not be as affected by what has happened, not to be motivated by it, and to forget its implications for what we ought to do is where God sees us to fall down. They were not mindful of your miracles, your wonders that you did among them. And, it just goes all the way through the scriptures. And people were worrying about getting hungry after seeing Jesus feed 4,000 people or 5,000 people. Why would you do that after you saw such a miracle? Wouldn't that change your thinking forever? No, not if you're not thinking of it, not if you're not mindful of it. That's the point. You can't afford to lose these things from our memories. So let's talk a little bit about the worthy credentials of Yahweh established by the prophet of Isaiah. So if we had somebody coming from some other country and he was, or she was, coming to our ecclesia, we may ask them, well, what are your credentials? Like, how do we know you are a Christadelphian? What ecclesia do you come from? And if need be, just ask a few questions just to see that really they do understand things as we do. We have never seen these people before. Well, God offers us worthy credentials. If anyone wanted to know, well, who is Yahweh? Or who is Isaiah? The book tells us very clearly. So in Isaiah chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, and we're going to go through a few verses here, and I'll put them all on the screen, but it might be important to just note them if you have or are making notes. So in Isaiah 8, verses 17, I'm always quoting from the New King James, unless I'll say differently. I find that very important, that when you're constantly looking at different versions, what they say is to remember when you copy a verse, to make sure you copy where you got it from, because sometimes you see that's not what my Bible says. We just happen to be using a different version or an English version, that is. So it says, I will wait on Yahweh, who hides his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Here am I, and the children whom Yahweh has given me. We are for signs and wonders in Israel from Yahweh of hosts, who dwells in Mount Zion. So you can see the partnership that Isaiah felt he had with his God. Imagine even saying that I will wait on Yahweh, who, although he hides his face from the house of Jacob, I will hope in him. Here am I, and the children whom Yahweh has given me. Do we ever express that idea, before our God? Do you ever feel like that? But then to say we are for signs and wonders in Israel from Yahweh of hosts is obviously elevated because of Isaiah being a prophet and God using his family to speak to Israel in different capacities. So this man and his God were really united in the way they presented what God wanted Israel to hear from him. Now, in Isaiah chapter 45, verses 5 to 7, you have probably the best description of Yahweh that you can find in the work of Isaiah. And this is how Yahweh revealed himself to Isaiah. I am Yahweh, there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none besides me. I am Yahweh, there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, Yahweh, do all these things. Now, there's things revealed in those 3 verses that are really significant to us. First of all, to tell someone who thinks there's a fallen angel devil somewhere, and then you say, well, look at this verse. It says, I create calamity, or as King James would say it, I create evil. God creates evil? And it just opens up maybe a new panorama of thinking for people who have been so, trained and taught by their families, by their church, that no, there's a fallen angel devil. He's the one. God is all good. God doesn't do that. Well, no, you have to look at what God does, and Isaiah brings that out. If you don't want people to know about it, then you don't elevate Isaiah's work. So if you have a view of Isaiah, as I think a lot of people did coming into the discovery of the scrolls, that why would you really want to make anything of the scroll? Like, we've had Isaiah around for centuries of time. People have read it. They know what it says. Well, if they really knew what it says, they would have treated the scrolls differently. And I just met a man that has sort of altered the way I think of other people who believe in the Trinity. I'd never heard an argument like this before, and this was at the C&E. And this man said, there are 2 Yahwehs. And he goes to a couple verses where he can't explain how that Yahweh in one part of the verse and Yahweh in another part of the verse appear to be 2 different individuals. So he has no background to the way we would explain it. And so he sees that as both the God and the Son. He never says God the Son. He just says the Son have the name Yahweh. And that convinces him partly of the Trinity. But aren't the words telling us that I am Yahweh and there is no other? Like, how can you make 2 out of what that verse says? And when you go to the Hebrew and you see that, people might struggle with the idea that the King James and many of the other English versions use the Lord, but in the Hebrew text, it is Yahweh. And there's a whole explanation of why. In our English text, we see the words the Lord, capitalized, mind you, but in the Hebrew text, we just see those 4 letters of the tetragrammaton, which represent Yahweh. So there is a lot of things that the text itself, that is the scroll of Isaiah, teaches us about what we need to know about our God that are not known out there. And the fact that of all the other things that the shrine in the book tells you about the scrolls, it doesn't tell you what Isaiah says. That was what was missed. And even in our exhibition that we put on, the Bible exhibition as it went around, and we took up this idea because remember in 1611, that was when the King James was written, and the 400th anniversary, 2011, we here in Book Road put on a special event to just be a memorial of what happened in 1611. And even we in our Bible exhibition, we had a model of what they have in the shrine of the book, but we didn't go through, as we could have, of the things that the scroll of Isaiah was saying that people haven't heard. And that goes from the past, like in Isaiah 45, it goes through the present and it goes into the future. This scroll is like a little gospel that teaches people what we would find we teach other people using the whole Bible. Now look at this. And I want you to look at these dates, because the dates are really quite impressive when you see that most of us listening to this or watching this would realize that we were alive in 2014. What did we make of this? So Nebuchadnezzar's name was found in a clay tablet. Now, some of these were found before they were published, In other words, they were investigated to make sure they weren't a fraud. They wanted to make sure the people got it right. That's what it says. Many scholars looking at it, and then finally they publish it. So in 2014, here's a tablet that's found from the old city of Babylon that has the name Nebuchadnezzar right in it. What's that do to your mind? That here we have today being able to go back to that old city and find in the old city a tablet like this where people wrote what they wanted to write on it, but it had the name Nebuchadnezzar right there. Doesn't it make you feel stronger that what we read and what we know of in the book of Isaiah and other books which talk about this is right? History is true. And we need to be a student of history. We need to be able to call these things up when we need to speak of them. Now, in Isaiah 13, I wanted to just take you through something here. And this is another thing that's really impressed me, but it's a little hard to connect to. So let's see what we can make of this. In Isaiah 13, verses 19 to 20, it talked about the prophecy concerning Babylon. So you got to go way back. This is Isaiah saying this. And the Babylon that was there was gaining strength in his time, because you remember that the people from Babylon came to Isaiah at the time that the Assyrian army was destroyed there. And they wanted to see through the place. And Isaiah had to reveal to Hezekiah that they're going to take it all in time. So it was significant what they had to say about Babylon. And what Isaiah said, it will never be inhabited. It would be like as God who overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Nor will it be settled from generation to generation. Now, I remember reading some of the things about this because in Christadelphian, our heritage has been that there's been a lot of writings about things like this because people who love the Word of God and want to be able to use it as an authoritative mouthpiece for what they have to say about the gospel would use this to illustrate how important the Bible is to us. Well, if you look at the site, you have a picture of it, or if you actually went there and looked at it, you would see many of the ruins. And if you were a student of history, you would know how it became ruined and how it laid for centuries and centuries like that, with one exception. And that exception was this building that you could see in that picture, but this is blowing it up a bit. And that's obviously modern. Now, I don't know if you can remember those days. I can remember those days because I remember Saddam Hussein and his desires to rebuild Babylon. It was being reported in the Time magazine and other magazines of the day about what he was going to do. He was going to rebuild Babylon, and he'd got started, and he was putting a lot of money into it, and he was the king of Iraq, and nobody's going to stop him from doing it. And I thought, this is an interesting contest. He's going up against Yahweh. Yahweh says it will never be rebuilt, and Saddam says, I'm going to do it. And there's a big story behind this. It would make a very good talk itself, because you can go in to see what he did to try to illustrate this fact. He made his bricks, and he said, Nebuchadnezzar too. Like, I'm the new Nebuchadnezzar. He made his statements about he was going to make the glory of Babylon come back. And you think, something's got to happen. He said, God said it would never be rebuilt, and you're saying it's going to be built. God will stop him. Can you think of how he did? There was a war going on. They thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And Britain and America combined, and I can still remember the newspaper front that showed, I think it was called Shock and Awe. That was the name or the title on the newspaper. And it showed the missiles that were being fired from ships in the Mediterranean towards Iraq to take on Saddam Hussein, because they made the world believe, I don't know whether they really believed that he had weapons of mass destruction, but they made everybody believe that was the justification. He had used chemical weapons on even his own people at one time. So they had some justification for it, but we know now that they didn't find anything. Well, what did they do? It was 1987 when he tried to do this. Where were you in 1987? Okay, probably many of us can remember that time. Well, this is the sort of the culmination of it. In 2003, 1987 to 2003, that was quite a long time it took to get him. But the Americans got him, and this is the picture. It showed how they managed to get him. This was if you can see under, it's right here. There's a little hole there, and this was a stone that was covering it, and that's called a spider hole. He was down that hole, and he was hiding down there in a little bunker. But you see, when you offer, $100,000, $500,000, $1 million to anybody that can help us find him, their people do come forward. And they found him. And they got him out, and they got him out alive. Do you remember the picture of Saddam Hussein? It was displayed on the newspapers. He looked pretty rough. And later on, he was hung. That was the end of his building venture. And I think it's quite significant to note that Yahweh's word was vindicated. How many people ever saw that aspect of it? You see, it's we're the witnesses of these things. It's up to us to make the news, to tell people how Yahweh's word was vindicated by what prophet Isaiah said would happen. It would never be rebuilt. Saddam Hussein tries to build it, and God illustrates at the end, no, you're not building it. And it's done by a venture that never mentions that God's involved, never mentions what was wrong about what he was doing. It just happens. And there's a few people with Bibles open who know why it happened, at least what God achieved out of it. See, Yahweh's word is trustworthy. Look at another case in 2 Chronicles 32, verse 30. And it's just a reference to this, but most people can see how that this is speaking of what Hezekiah did in bringing the water from the upper part of the city of Jerusalem underground to the bottom part, so that the city always had access to water, even though it was under siege. So 2 Chronicles 32, verse 30, this same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of Upper Gihon and brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah prospered in all his work. So it clearly says that's what Hezekiah did. Well, this is a little picture from BiblePlaces.com, and it's a lot of that's on the internet. If you've never been there, Dorothy and I were there. We were hoping to be able to walk through this ourselves, but the lineup was so long, it would have taken almost all the time we had available in the morning to go through there, so we decided not to do it. But it might have been a bit too claustrophobic anyway to go through that. That's a long tunnel, and it's narrow. You got just a little bit more than your shoulders, and you're going through this, and it's obviously cut out. And there's some interesting things about this, because Isaiah talks about it. I don't know that you could pinpoint that he's talking about that particular tunnel, but he does talk about gathering the waters to the pool, and God's taking to task the man who was in charge at that time, who thought of all these things, but he never really thought of his God. It's just another exhortation that can be found there. But in 1880, see what's late, 1880, they discovered there was an inscription there, because people didn't know who did this or how it was done. They just know that somebody had obviously done it because the chisel marks were in the stone. But that's the inscription they found. Now, if you and I were looking at that, I think we might be able to conclude that there appears to be some writing on it, but what the writing meant or who wrote it, we would be out of being able to help in that case. But this is what was written. And I can't be entirely sure that all of this was written. It says that the author's translation at the bottom was on there, and I give you the location of where you can find this yourself. But it said something like, while the stone cutters were wielding the picks, each toward his co-worker, And while there were still 3 cubits to tunnel through, the voice of a man was heard calling out to his co-worker, because there was a fissure in the rock running from south to north. And on the final day of tunneling, each of the stonecutters was striking the stone forcefully so that as to meet his co-worker, pick after pick. And then the water began to flow from the source of the pool to a distance of 1,200 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the stonecutters. Now, to see that cut into the stone in that language, which goes back to the time, was pretty, I think, pretty great. And I don't really want to talk about the tunnel anymore, but just to illustrate how the Bible mentioned something that no one could verify until this discovery was made. And the book of Isaiah has got so many of these things where you can finally see that what happened is verifiable in modern history. People were there. They found it. That's what it said. Now, Yahweh's word is not always being fulfilled or has been fulfilled. It's also being fulfilled. Now, I don't know how many of you can connect the thought just from what you see on the screen. But in Isaiah 9, verses 6 to 7, where it says, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." How many of you have ever been to a presentation of Handel's Messiah? Hey, how many? Okay, so there's quite a few have been there. And I remember going to one with Dorothy. We went up to Guelph, a presentation up there, and it was really nicely done. But what really gave me a difficulty was that when we looked at what happened in the intermission, instead of people being, put in a more spiritual tone of thinking in the intermission, they're all rejoicing, having a drink, and merrymaking. So the actual message was just going right over their heads. They didn't understand the message. It was just music they were listening to. But unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given. From our point of view, that's done. We're waiting for the government to be upon his shoulder. So Yahweh's word through the prophet Isaiah is being fulfilled. And we find this from time to time in the scriptures that we're halfway or a quarter way through a verse. And it could be centuries of time between the fulfillment of the first part and the last part. But every time we listen to Handel's Messiah, and what's beautiful about Handel's Messiah is it's just scripture put to music. I mean, it really is lovely to listen to it and to see how the man was able to make such magnificent music for such magnificent words. Now, the great antiquity of the Dead Sea Scrolls is something that I thought was very helpful. This was pointed out by Yigal. He was the person who was in charge of the excavations that were being made around Israel at the time, 1947 to 56, when they were trying to find more scrolls, going into caves that people had never been in to see if there were any bits and pieces of scrolls there. But about the Isaiah scroll, this is what he had to say. "Thus we know that even from this second source, the Septuagint, we have not full texts of the Bible earlier than the 4th century AD. In the light of that fact, it is easy to appreciate the great importance of the 2 Isaiah texts discovered among the Qumran scrolls. These are about 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew text known to us, and about 500 years older than the earliest Greek version of the Septuagint." So that little thought of skepticism that sometimes comes into our mind, even in our minds, that maybe there is some disconnect somewhere. Like, how could people still have, reliable copies of the scrolls? Well, if you just continue on what he had to say, He said, what is astonishing is that despite their antiquity and the fact that the scrolls belong to this pre-standardization period, they are on the whole almost identical with the Masoretic text known to us. And this establishes a basic principle for all future research on texts of the Bible. Not even the hundreds of slight variations established in the text, affecting mainly spelling and occasional word substitution, can alter that fact. I think that was a real answer to the people that I've heard personally who say you couldn't have a reliable document that is being copied and copied and copied. And when you looked at these copies, like even the scroll that they put around in the shrine of the book, if you look carefully at it, you will see there's little notations on it. There's things that have been crossed out and other words written in. There's been places where there's been a tear and something's been sewn in. Like it's not as if it's a beautiful text and no one's ever touched it. No, it was a text they used. And yes, they did have to copy it. And yes, they had to check the copy. But when this man comes along and says, well, look, I'm looking at this scroll. He was looking at the actual Isaiah scroll they found, and he knew what the other Isaiah scroll said. He's saying, look, on the whole, they're almost identical with the Masoretic text known to us. From my mind, that just settled that issue. Now, people will think of things you've never heard of to try to disprove the authenticity of the scriptures, to try to get us off the track that this is God speaking to us. What we've got to do is to stay on that track, is to be able to answer that criticism with things like this. Like, here's a man who is able to read that scroll. How many people could ever read that scroll? Well, he was able to. Now, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about Isaiah's credentials. Here's the prophet. We know that there is a test of a prophet. So in Ezekiel chapter 33:33, it says, when this cometh to pass, lo, it will come, then shall they know that a prophet hath been among them. Now you can find other places in the Bible where it talks about that, but that's essentially what has to be there. Could anybody go to the prophecy of Isaiah and find things that Isaiah said that actually came to pass so that we could know whether there was any likelihood that what he says about the future will come to pass? That's proper thinking. That's the logic that's required in trying to prove things to ourselves and discard that little nagging feeling that maybe, this isn't what it really claims to be. So if we go back to this prophecy and have a look at it, I want to just illustrate what's come to light recently. Now, that's a fairly recent picture. Certainly that picture was taken since I've been to Jerusalem, because I never saw this part of here like that before. So the Wailing Wall is over here. There's the Temple Mount. Here's the Eastern Gate. This is the Southern Wall. And this is where the excavation has been, and of course in this part as well. But this excavation is where they have been revealing things that are really very fascinating to just think of them. So Isaiah's credentials are started right in the very first verse of the Bible. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah. When was he living? He was living at the time of Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So in this investigation into the ancient history, because there's people in Israel just love this archaeology, love going in there, finding things that tell them of what the civilization was like beforehand. But there was Hezekiah's and Isaiah's name were found. It was reported in 2015. Now, if we're keeping up, you see, this is our obligation to this, is to keep up with what's being found. So that if someone tells you, well, was there ever an Isaiah, or was there ever a Hezekiah? You could go to what this lady, who is, if I can read it from the screen, Dr. Eliot Mazar, a very renowned Israeli archaeologist, and it's reported in the Biblical Archaeology Review. by Brian Thomas in 2018. So that's sometimes the lag between what they found and what they report. So the Archaeology magazine is something that Dorothy and I have had. We finally got rid of it because it was just containing too much information that was skeptical. That was, maybe this and maybe that. And I thought, I don't want something that is blending what we want to be the truth with something where people are not sure, but they're presenting it as if, have a look at it and see what you think. But there's what they found. They found them 10 feet apart in the ruins in that southern wall in 2015, reported in 2018. A little seal that had Hezekiah's name in it, and a little seal that had Isaiah's name. Now, they were, under the criticism of 3 years, so it was published in 2018, and there didn't seem to be any doubt in what we were reading that they actually had found that. If you look at the scroll, you might wonder why Hezekiah's name was ever found with that. That's an ankh. That's a symbol of Egypt. But they didn't say it was Hezekiah's seal. They said Hezekiah's name was found in it. And you have to be careful when you're looking at this, is just what they're making of it. But I found it was really significant to me that they said they found it just 10 feet apart at a certain level of depth. So they're down, 15, 20 feet from the ground level when they found these things. So Isaiah, is he a true prophet? Well, there's significant data in Isaiah 44 about Cyrus. Now, Cyrus is a well-known name in history. He was the king of the Persians, and it says of him in verse 28 of Isaiah 44, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Now, if you think of this, it was stated in 720 BC. That was about 200 years before he was born. So this is a prophecy. Would there ever be a man called Cyrus? Would he ever do what God says he would do? He would be the person saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Well, they found the Cyrus cylinder. And the Cyrus cylinder essentially said that and illustrated it was from Cyrus himself. This is very strong, positive testimony. And my point in even bringing this up is, look at what the people could have made of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If they went back to that shrine of the book and they said, now look, what we want to do is we want to tell you what this book says to illustrate the real truth of the prophecy of the book that was discovered. And they said in some panel somewhere around the book, what he said about Cyrus, like just essentially saying this and drawing attention to the fact we've also found the Cyrus cylinder. Wouldn't that make people think, boy, that's a significant book. Maybe I should read it. Maybe I should see what else is in there. Not a word. You wouldn't find that testimony there. They didn't make anything of the scroll. I was very disappointed. If we go on with Isaiah's credentials, now you'd have to read the record fairly carefully for this. But Isaiah made quite a statement, and he said it on the basis of what you see in verse 6 of Isaiah 37, thus saith Yahweh, speaking to Hezekiah, don't be afraid of the words thou hast heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Well, what was the likelihood of that? This man had come all the way from Assyria, and he'd be just knocking off one kingdom after another. There was no city that could stand up against him. He made Hezekiah and all his servants know that. He reviewed it before them. So what would there be for anyone to think that Jerusalem would have a different fate? And you see, you can go to various museums around the world, and you can see how they lifted this right out of various parts of Assyria and illustrated that, yeah, the Assyrians did live. These people were historical characters, and this is how they treated captives. So it's very historical. So he did die that night, or not that night, but his army died that night. Then he went back and his sons killed him. And I wanted to just sort of finish this off with looking at what Isaiah had to do to be a witness for God. Like, this is no little thing. It says in Isaiah 20, at the same time Yahweh spake by Isaiah the son of Amos, saying, go and remove the sackcloth from your body and take your sandals off your feet. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. Then Yahweh said, just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a wonder against Egypt and Ethiopia. And then he went on to talk about how they would walk barefoot and naked out of the shame of being taken captives. I think these are remarkable comments to be made about what it would be like to be a prophet for God. And God asked these prophets. You remember Ezekiel having to lay on his side for over a year in order to illustrate to people who saw this what was going to happen to them. Well, this is our God. This is how he works with his prophets. It's really settling for us to understand how real that relationship was. So Isaiah's credentials for the Jews probably was the one thing that put them off, because Isaiah told them about the work of their Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. And the one chapter that is so detailed about that, Isaiah 53, is just one chapter I don't think many Jews want to read. But I wanted just to have a look at Isaiah 6. In verse 8, he says, also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I, that's Isaiah, said, here am I, send me. And he said, go and tell this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Then 700 years later, Jesus, standing before the Jews, said to them, and in them, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, seeing you will see and not perceive. And there's a number of quotations that Jesus makes from the prophecy of Isaiah. A number of quotations from the apostles from the book of Isaiah. Like it's a key book in the whole Bible. It establishes very well the credentials of Isaiah to speak on behalf of God, of how Jesus picked it up, the Apostle Paul picked it up, how we see it being fulfilled before us today. Why not use that book more strenuously in our witness? Is I think what it teaches us. And then we have this beautiful picture of Isaiah's prophecy of the future of the world government. Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, Isaiah 65. And he's not talking about destroying the literal earth, but he is talking about destroying the governments and the world order that we presently see. And from what we presently see, we can only say, may it happen soon, to be able to bring the peace and the prosperity that vision actually teaches us in the book. So I'm going to leave it there. And next week, we, Lord willing, will be dealing with what the children of Israel did about what they heard.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.